Let's get started. Thank you for joining us. And sorry for the technical difficulties. There's always
That was
something.
me.
So we're here with Aaron Case, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself a little bit more. If anybody has any questions whilst Aaron does his presentation, please put them in the chat box, and then we'll get to them at the end, or maybe if it's suitable through within your presentation, we'll address them then. But yeah, just type in any questions in the chat box and we'll monitor that. And I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure I can see. Oh, this works well. So yeah, I'm going to talk about, as you can see, endurance strategies, but I'm going to talk about it from a perspective. I know you guys have a great program already. So it's more to do with how to increase your distance without bringing with you old injuries, creating new injuries, biomechanical efficiency, how to get endurance from a perspective that's not just based on minutes and speed and volume and those kind of things. So, and hopefully that'll help. And again, you can ask questions throughout and you can sort of alert me, but there's time at the end regardless as we go. So my background and how I got into this was back in the 90s. I was a trainer, a running coach, a certified strength and conditioning specialist, and I studied the biomechanics of running at UBC and then as a chiropractor. And then I've run several marathons in the meantime. But what I noticed was as a chiropractor, I was limited by exercises, stretches, joint things. And I realized that a lot of runners were coming in with problems, not necessarily created by running. Some of them were, but they had a lot of things in the tissue, in the soft tissues. And back in the 90s and early 2000s, there were dynamic MRIs that were showing that a lot of the stuff and restrictions is in the tendons, the muscle, the fascia. And what happens is and we'll talk about why running is unique and why you can't run as much as you can cycle and swim, and how it breaks down tissue and how the body tries to protect that tissue. If you run too fast, too soon, there becomes a protective effect. So what happens is if you overdo it with running, which is a lot, as I said, easier to do than with other sports because of the impact, and we'll get into that later, the muscle gets these little micro tears. And once it gets these micro tears, if they're not given enough time to heal and we go back into something that we're not used to doing again, and that could be even fast walking or slow running, it's all what you've already adapted to. And there's a huge scale range on what creates these problems, from people running 1 mile to sort of 100 miles. It could be the same level of damage depending on what you bring into running. But what happens is these little micro tears say, if you're going to keep using this tissue in the same way, we're going to start to put sticky dead tissue in there and stick two muscles together so that one muscle isn't as vulnerable to tearing, which creates, as a survival pattern, a torn muscle is far worse than one that has scar tissue in it. So it's an adaptation process that's sometimes useful and protective and allows us to put muscles together, but then you have to compensate and start using another muscle, the other side of your body, and your biomechanics start to change. And you can run through this for many months and years sometimes, but you're leaving residue behind. And that obviously for endurance in the end catches up with people. So I started using things like active release and Graston, which is sports medicine instruments, Shockwave for deep scar tissue in fascia, tendons, ligaments, and then some other stuff for deep healing, because there's a lot of stuff that is created in the soft tissue, but there's a lot of ways to protect against that as well. So we'll get into that. So injuries, are they your fault? Well, for me, they're never my fault. I always blame my parents for pretty much everything that I get, but I don't actually blame them. It's not really their fault. It's interesting. I took a genetic test and I found that when I was running marathons, and I was able to get down into the 240s, but that's actually way off the really elite runners. But I found that I could only run about 3 times a week, even with my time dropping every few marathons, or every marathon sort of taking minutes off my time. I found that there's a particular gene I had. There's a variant that I have. It's called collagen, basically A1A, and my tendons are very slow to recover than maybe someone else's. And I also found that in my genetic testing, it said likely you're not a sprinter. So without even looking at anything, they could tell that my fast twitch muscles take a long time to repair. So I have to separate my running by even more number of hours off, depending on the intensity and the distance, of course. But I found that I maximized I may have had more genetic potential, but I maximized a lot of it with how much I was willing to train by actually running a little bit less. And the intensity, if I went intense, I also had to take time off. So I was kind of caught in the middle of not being able to do too much volume, but the high intensity stuff made me very sore and delayed my recovery as well. So I just found a pattern that worked for me. So it's very individual as well. I also say that they're not your fault because Dr. Jack Taunton, who you may know, he was a legend in sports medicine. He was chief medical officer of the 2010 Olympics, and I think he ran 70 marathons. And in the 220s, he was much faster than I was. And they ran differently back then. They did huge mileage, but he had pretty much every injury. He knows everything there is to know about sports medicine. But I remember going into his office. It was a funny story where someone came out of the office and I was getting treatment for an obscure pelvic stress fracture. I'd run too far, even with the mileage that I did. It was too far at that point. And someone came out of his office and said that guy has every time I come in here, every injury I've ever had, that guy has it. And so I thought, no, this injury is special to me. This is my injury. He's not going to have this injury. And of course I go in there and we talk about what I have and how much time off to take and those kind of things. And he mentioned 3 times. He said the New York Marathon, Chicago, and he knew exactly the times that he has all these treatments. So back in the day, they used to run more mileage, but even though he knew things, getting injured is sort of part of exercise. You avoid the big diseases, but you sort of get the sort of more the smaller things that set you back a little bit. So I kind of, whenever I do a talk, I talk about injury management, the little amount of time off you can take rather than pure prevention. I kind of joke that the people who are in a maintenance phase where they don't get injured, they're not trying hard enough. And I don't really mean that. I just mean that there's a blissful place sometimes you can get to where you're not getting injured. And that can last for some people, it's surprising, years, decades even. But if they're not testing their ceiling every now and then, the capacity, that ceiling, sounds a little scary, but that ceiling will start to lower and close in on you. If you're not testing your ability to adapt to variety, if you're keeping the same run, the same distance, the same way, you're actually slowly over time, eventually that ceiling will push down that ability. So running easy for the most part, which we'll talk about because I'm also lazy as part of my genetics, we'll talk about that, is to do, mostly easy mileage and adaptation of the tendons and other things. But then once maybe 20% of the running and other things and strength training is to push that ceiling up and keep it higher so that you can remain in more of an injury-free zone, or just little tweaks here and there rather than bump down your true performance and your ability to do other things rather than just running. And running also, I want to say that it finds your pre-existing limitations. So anything you bring into running, when I was in my 20s, my knees, I'm almost 50, and my knees are far, far worse in my early 20s because I had played basketball on concrete and I had some scar tissue and I had things built up and I couldn't sit for an hour without my knees aching so much I'd have to stand up. And I got some treatment and strength and things and figured it out. But I found that they got worse only in my first marathon. And once I figured it out and treated it, then it instantly allowed me to run many more miles for many more decades because I had brought in some pre-existing tightness thing. That running, it's so repetitive. It doesn't necessarily create more injuries, but it'll sure find the limitations that you have. So if you can work through those and go, get treatment from someone who's interested in running, they'll know the research better than someone. It doesn't even matter what the profession is. It's more of a hobby, and they'll have done more research in the area and not sort of maybe have you give up as soon, unless you want to give up running. You don't have to run, but that's just been my experience. So the recovery pyramid, I don't know if it's a pyramid necessarily. I just like it sounds more official if I say pyramid. But really, it's just the number of time at the bottom, at the top, cardiovascular. So if you just get out of breath, you recover very quickly. And then as the tissue, as we go down this list, it's longer and longer recovery time. So imagine that part of the pyramid. So if you get out of breath, your cardiovascular system, unless we won't even get into sort of extreme endurance, actually creates fibrosis and scar tissue of the heart, but that's at a very, very extreme level that very few people ever get to. But basically you recover within a few hours. You can do things, and that's why elite runners can run twice a day, and that's no problem. General muscle contraction, so just pushing off, really easy running, really slow and short, you can recover the elites in half a day because they actually aren't creating damage. They've become used to it. So that takes 1 to 2 days for muscle. When a muscle's tightening under a load, swimming, cycling, doing that daily is very normal. However, eccentric muscle contraction, where the muscle is lengthening under a load, which is shock absorption, which is when you go down. Here's the model here, if you can see it. And then when you go down, I always show this one where the knee, this happens at the hip and the ankle as well. But when I bend my knee to absorb shock, as the sort of foot hits the ground, the ankle bends and then the knee bends as well. It's lengthening under a load, and that creates micro tears in the muscle and the tendon, more so than when I tighten the muscle and push off the other way. So that can take, if it's downhill, right, you have more impact absorption, harder surface, it happens faster, so there's more yanking on the tissue. And then the faster you run, the more impact there is. It just goes up proportionally, generally to your speed. And so if you're running hard, fast, a long marathon, downhill, you can actually die. I say that jokingly, but there's a thing called rhabdomyolysis where if you get it really badly and you damage your tissue, it's very rare. And you can do it in other things other than running, but it just shows you that this eccentric, and you can do it with concentric if you do enough of it. You get so much breakdown of the protein, it goes into the kidney and you get kidney failure. And it's not something to be concerned with generally, but it just indicates that different kinds of muscle contraction, which running is mostly an eccentric breakdown of the muscle. If you're not used to that, but you can adapt. You can adapt to running downhill on hard surfaces a little faster, but it just takes a lot longer and part of this talk is just sort of how to build your mileage. If you find you're on a harder surface, you need to take more time off. Whenever you add speed, there's a more of a component. If it's more downhill, you think, oh, that wasn't a hard workout, and it wasn't on your cardiovascular system, but it was on your muscles and tendons. Now, tendons are a big one. Tendons are what I treat. Almost everything to do with running often ends up in the tendons. We create micro tears in the muscle tissue, but the muscle tissue recovers much faster because it has way more blood flow. So a good example is the Achilles. So it can take 4 to 7 days if you've really yanked the Achilles, and which you do when you run. So basically back of the heel, when I go forward, I'm absorbing shock right here. So I'm yanking the Achilles and it has to plyometrically, which means respond elastically, and then the calf contracts it and it pushes off. So that particular action, it is the densest, whitest. White means very little blood flow. Even some of the synovial fluid on the sheath of the tendon helps try to get it to heal quicker than it normally does. So Achilles is an epidemic of, experienced runners in their 30s, 40s, 50s. I treat Achilles probably 2 times a day. It's amazing how often there's scar tissue, tendinopathy in the Achilles. So if you start to get symptoms in the Achilles, that's probably the number one thing to sort of be careful of, and take a bit of rest. Rest can be magical for 2-3 days, 4 days, no treatment necessarily. If those few days within a week of rest can sometimes make all the difference. And active recovery, still getting blood flow, moving the Achilles is okay, cycling, these other things, and moving the tendons is better than bed rest. But be careful with the ones that plyometrically, running, bouncing, jumping. Some people will take time off running, but they'll do a boot camp with jumping lunges and a lot of plyometrics. And that's, yes, there's less repetitions, but it still can affect the Achilles. So just sort of be careful with what the cross training is. And if you feel like it's bending this back, or you're on your toes and really loading up those tendons. And then again, tendons, they heal slower. You think of IT band as a tendon. It's one of the top injuries. Runner's knee, yes, it's typically around the patella, but it's because the tendons aren't healing, or anything around a joint is where the tendon attaches to the bone, and that's implicated in the problems. Even plantar fasciitis. The fascia in the foot gets irritated. I treat that almost every day, but what I'm treating is the tendon. There's these little muscles, the flexor brevis, digitorum brevis, and things like that attach to the heel that have developed scar tissues. They can't control the fascia anymore. So the fascia starts twisting because the muscle and then the tendon hasn't recovered. So it's usually a fibrotic section in there. So again, just, try stretching it, try resting it, and be careful of your tendons. If it's around the joint, just take a little bit more time off than if it's between the joints and in the muscle belly, because there's more time. Ligaments, that's only if you sprain your ankle. That can take, a grade 1 is like a day or two. A grade 3 can be, it obviously is a tear. So that grade 3 is a bad one where it actually rips in half. But ankle sprains are sort of a different story because you don't technically push into them eccentrically. So that's typically a non-running type of thing that's separate. And then I just put my ego is my softest tissue because it takes a lifetime to repair. Enough about me. I talked about dying if you run downhill too far. Forget about that point. That's a little scary. So why is running? Why do we need more recovery with running? Running is catabolic. So what that means, and we talked about how much more breakdown. So this is not to be confused with a cataholic, someone who prefers the company of cats. This is not a cataholic, but I like to use the word cat in there because you think of something breaking down, your cat scratching something is breaking it down. So that eccentric contraction, that lengthening under a load, the tendons, this is kind of a review, less blood flow, less recovery. So the little tendons by the joints, if those get irritated, cross train, take some time off, stop getting that pulling impact of running. And I've already kind of gone through this slide entirely already. Are there any questions sort of midway, or I could do that at the end as well. So now this is the lazy is the new smart, this was great news for me because I'm smart because I'm lazy. I think that's how it works. I'm not going to talk about sleep, but that's kind of the joke with sleep. Now people realizing sleep is very important for brain, and being lazy and sleeping in is actually one of the best things you can do for recovery and programming of skills in sports and just mental clarity and all that. But the reason I say that is they did a study, and this is just an example of other studies that are out there that are sort of showing this. There's a lot on the HIIT training part, but when you sort of transfer it to running, HIIT training allows it basically, running is so specific that we have to test running separate from VO2 max. For example, you can bring a VO2 max that's super high. Michael Phelps as a runner, he does very poorly because it just doesn't translate into, yes, he'll translate a little bit faster, but when you're doing running, your cardiovascular system can be very prepared from intervals and things in other areas, but the soft tissues and other things just can't recover as much. And so they'll decrease your performance quite quickly. So this is an example of a 10-week study. One group did about 77 or 80% low intensity, and the other one did 46%. So almost 30% more lazy running. It is not lazy, it's actually smart running. So, and they improved their time by 40 seconds. And there's other examples of this over the control. So they both did intensity. They both did about 20% in intense training. And that's what I was talking about, getting your ceiling up, not getting injured, but doing a small amount of intense intervals once you get your baseline. And we'll talk about sort of how to strengthen, because again, follow the program of the Sunrun. I'm not trying to change that, but a lot of people will get out and just exaggerate that easy running a little bit. So the people who ended up with slower results and not improved 10K times, which 10K is a test of endurance, speed over that same endurance. They were just doing more medium volume runs. So they were sort of doing the beach run where someone might be watching. I'm just going to go a little bit faster. Someone might pass me. I'm trying to catch that person. Good things that you get motivated by. You don't want to do. You want us to take about almost 80% or 4-to-1 ratio of your running. And I often have to hold back. And once I started doing this, I actually had better performance in my marathons as well. But you got it, and it allows you to recover so much more quickly that when you do anything of quality, or you do the strength training, you're actually doing the quality. You're not still fatigued by the other running. So how easy? There's all sorts of ways to do it. I find that the exertion can be quite low here, 3 to 4 out of 10. You're often holding yourself back. The ability to talk, if you can breathe through your nose, you're definitely sort of in that easy zone. For some people, that's walking, or that's very little jogging followed by walking. So this is just something to kind of think about after, during or after the program. Another thing to keep your cadence high, because a lot of people sort of start to slow down and they get inefficient, economically inefficient, which affects their endurance, by taking 3 steps per breath in. So you'd go 1, 2, 3 as you breathe in, and then 1, 2, 3 as you breathe out. So you're basically taking 6 steps through a cycle. And your rate will instantly increase if you get above that ventilatory threshold, which is into that moderate running, which is just, it's actually making you slower and slower recovery and everything over time, and taking away from your easy benefits and your harder benefits. Heart rate, there are methods. The simplest one is 180 minus your age might generally work for keeping you in that lower zone. But the problem with heart rate is that it doesn't just indicate the muscles, the zone that you're training in. Heart rate, if the temperature is higher, heart rate, you could use 5 beats to 10 beats per minute to send the blood flow, not to the muscle where we think we're measuring it, but to the periphery of the skin in order to dissipate the heat to keep you cooler. Caffeine can raise it a few degrees, hydration levels, food, muscle damage can tell your central nervous system to decrease your heart rate. So then we produce stress hormones like cortisol to increase your blood pressure to try to make up for this. So heart rate is not even useful once you start to run for a long period of time anyway. It can be a useful tool for sure. But if you use these other tests and maybe coordinate it with heart rate, you're better off going into those easier zones and protecting your tendons and ligaments and sort of getting the maximum performance benefit anyways. Because we're really trying, as you build to your 10K, to not add little scar tissues, things you have to deal with, in the next few years if you want to continue running, or other sports, because scar tissue just sort of stays in there once you sort of develop it. It rarely breaks free on its own. So how do we harness the impact of running? So again, I talked about specificity. That's sort of the key. So what you're doing with running when you land, and why sometimes the fittest people who get into running end up with the most injuries, because they're bringing a cardiovascular and muscle strength, ligament density, fascial tissue from a specific to another sport into running. And so when they run, what happens is, if you run on any surface, but the harder the surface, the more impact that it has to deal with. So the 3 planes that happen is when I land. So when you walk, your footsteps are sort of beside each other. But the faster you go, the more you run, the more they come over. It's actually more efficient, because if you look at the footsteps, they're more in a straight line. If someone's sprinting, they're almost all like that. So that way your muscles have to do more up higher. But that's what challenges them. So you're basically running a little at this angle. So when my foot lands, I need to get my foot left. So my foot's going to pronate more. So that's going to come in. And then the femur is going to go in. And as you fatigue, as the kilometers go on, when we measure the leg going in, femoral adduction, it gets higher, even in elite runners. It adds a degree or two. So you have this plane getting played with. And then you also have the rotational plane getting played with. And they do help absorb shock, but you want them to happen very minimally. So we want to sort of sturdy these up. And unfortunately, the more flexible someone is, females tend to have more IT band because they're more flexible. So they need to add more strengthening to this to stabilize, to educate the flexibility so that it doesn't go too far in each direction. Too much stiffness is obviously bad too. But the key is to sort of whatever flexibility you have to sort of maintain it. So a really good thing, one of the most useful tools, even if you're doing heavy squats or deadlift, it doesn't activate these rotational and particularly these lateral, so side to side stabilizers, when they put testing in an EMG and they read on the muscles of the hips, the glute medius, minimus up in the hip, the controllers of these, the rotational aspect, a little bit of the glute max, by just putting a band around the ankles, you're getting that lateral component. And if I lift that leg off the ground, instantly it wants to do what running is doing when I land on the ground. So you can do crab walks, you can do side to side stepping, you can do sort of short little lunges, but you have to lift the leg, single leg squats. You have to lift the leg to get this pulling inward, because that's basically at the hip, it's going the other way. So if I lift my leg and do it this way, so stuff with it around your ankles. Now to get the rotational stuff, you want to get it, and there's me just Google sort of rotational lateral. There's you get around the knees. That tends to twist. It pulls the femur inward. So if I'm doing a squat, it tends to do the rotational. So I always do single leg squat, double leg squat, things, even jumping. You can add jumps to the squat versions because it's pulling it in, but it's also tends to want to rotate it. So I don't want to get into the exercises because you can't really do it on Zoom that well. I usually stand up when I do a talk to kind of do that, but try to hit those planes in some regard, and you'll be able to absorb shock a lot better. Now your main shock absorbers though are in this plane. Obviously I can bend this joint and the foot and the hip under, when I land under my hip, all three synergistically. That's where I want to absorb most of the shock. So a good thing to play with exercises is to, and a squat is a good example, but you can do it with lunges and you can do it with all sorts of exercises. If I just take a squat and let's say I'm going to do it, whether it's body weight or weighted, it doesn't really matter. I'm basically only training the hardest part of that squat. So when we run, let's take the knee for example, but it applies everywhere. If you go down to a squat 90 degrees, we never run at 90 degrees. And about 0 to 30 degrees is all that we get. So running is actually very limited in the strength curve that it actually, all it does. You're basically wiping your shoe on the ground until you dig a huge hole thousands of times. That is the strength. Everything else is recovery, centrifugal force, elasticity, triggering muscle spindles to get it back underneath the hip. But really the power is here. So we fatigue in a squat, no matter what the weight is, way down here in this 90 degree component, because that's the hardest phase. And we're never really training strength where we use it for running. So it is good to go down all the way because mobility, this trains mobility and flight phase. So what I mean by that is if you have strength at a depth, as long as everything's safe and the knees are behind the toes and you're doing it the right way, you're teaching that joint that it's safe at 90 degrees under a load. And over the years, as we get older, our nervous system will slowly tighten everything up with tone. And that has a lot to do with flexibility as we age, is the tone of the muscle protecting the joint because we're not strengthening it at end ranges. And running is the farthest thing from strengthening at end range. It's a very neutral range that we're strengthening it. So it's very important to go through other ranges doing other things. Because what happens is once I land, if I don't have the stiffness to come up and get a nice flight phase and my heel to come up and then my knee, this triggers a muscle spindle in my rectus femoris in the quad to then catch up. Now my body's gone that way. So then it's got to catch up and come back. And if I don't have the mobility and I'm just running with a straight leg, that's a lot of force on the hip because the hinge, the leg is the weight of the leg. You want to be closer to the muscle that's moving it. You package up a muscle and it's much easier to bring the leg back and get it back on the ground and keep your cadence high. And there's less impact because you're less likely to come and just thunk on your heel in front of your center of gravity. So mobility is really important. So training that bottom range is important. So I might do 10 and I realize, okay, let's say I have weight on my back. It doesn't matter that much. But if I feel fatigue, I haven't really trained the top 60 degrees of a squat at all. I've been limited by that bottom third. Now, if it's too heavy, people just bounce off the bottom. So they're not really strengthening. They're just bouncing off their ligaments because the weight's too heavy and they're just counting reps. Chasing reps is almost always leads to poor form. So if you go down and go slowly and make sure you train that, you'll have less weight to do anyway, and you can do less reps, but that's the point, is to train what you want to train, not to just cone up to a certain number. And then I feel like, okay, that's all I can go. And then with its weights or not, and then I'll do the middle 30 degrees. Now the middle 30 is great for hills because we need a little more in the 30 to 60 degrees when we get fatigued and that top range is tired and we start to bend our knees more, and different terrain where we have to turn. And so that middle degree is so fatigue and endurance. So I'll do maybe 7 right in the middle. So I don't really want to do another one way down here. I'm too fatigued and I don't just want to bounce off the bottom of the squat and cheat. So I'll do a bunch, maybe 7 here. And then at the very top, finally, I'm so fatigued, my slow twitch, my intermediate twitch fibers, that it's a strength training. And then I'll do the top 7 and I'll feel it in the quad and the leg for running much more specifically than I've gone to almost failure through the full range of motion. Does that make sense? You can apply this to almost any exercise. Because the top 30 degrees, that's more running, and that's also where you push off. You can jump or hop at the end. So at the end, I put the solution is you could do 7 of each, right? 7 full ones. And then you think, oh, I'm done. You realize, no, I can go part way down and do the middle degree of 7 more. And then you think, oh, I'm done. And then you realize, no, I can actually now strengthen the zone that's even more specific to running and shock absorption at the top on the 14th rep, but you don't have to go down very far. And then if I jump up at the top, I'm getting that plyometric. I'm training the tendons a little better if you hop or jump at the very top, right? Because that also adds the calf push off, which you kind of want a bit at the end. That's a long explanation, and it's probably a little better in person. But try that method, sort of, 7s to get the hardest range of any extra muscle you want to train, muscle group. That's great for cross training for running. And pick when you think you're done, just add the slightly easier range and do a few more reps in all those ranges. So the one of the last things, we're almost done, but one of the last things is, should I run like elite runners? Often there's a misconception that when you see an elite runner run, it's tempting to run like them. Like I was saying, the heel, when they're doing 4.5 minute, sub 5 minute miles in the marathon now, the males are, and the females are very, very close to that. So what happens, they're creating so much force through using their upper legs to pull back, and they're landing under their hip, that you see this crazy butt kicking kind of thing where some of them actually are within a centimeter. But that is completely based on reflexive reaction to the power. Their torso's taken off and everything's just trying to catch up, and they've got the mobility from having strength and through a deeper range of motion and flexibility to get that up, and it's basically just trying to catch up. So we want to do it if it's a drill. So high knees, ABCs, you might have heard of, they're great drills. But for anyone who's not elite, that heel should never come close to your butt. That basically, the centrifugal force is a very small circle. Everything else is going to cost oxygen and endurance and be excessive unless you're trying to go through a drill to activate dynamic stretching. Same thing for high knees. High knees are only high. It's going to cost oxygen. It's a not efficient way to actually run a race. You want to just have a reflexive subconscious mechanism kicked in and enough flexibility for it to create whatever height it needs to create based on how hard you pushed off, how long your femur versus your tibia is, and all the ways that it reflexively has tried to catch up with your upper body. Because it's a lighter entity than your torso, it goes past it. And then the elites will kind of pull, and they're already pulling back here. So they do land under their hip. It looks like they land way out in front of their center of gravity, but they don't. They're just creating force before they pull back. Arm swing, same thing. It's a futile, if you end up pushing your arms, consciously doing that, again, it's okay for a drill. It's okay for hill repeats, just to try to get that. But when you're trying to run up a hill in a 10K, it's going to cost you more oxygen to consciously yes, your legs might go faster, but if you make your legs go faster, your arms will catch up, and they will always, you can't create strength from your arms as a runner. So your legs will automatically swing, but you just want to keep them loose and have them based on your core strength and your mobility. The faster you go, the more they will swing. But to sort of lead with high knees and butt kicks and all that, that'll always be inefficient if it's conscious, unless you're doing it as a drill. And then again, I just put 100-mile weeks. I couldn't come close, no matter how, my genetic potential of anything wasn't even close to that. Some people get away with that and they've adapted to that, but that would break down 99% of all humans. But for them, they can absorb it and it works really well. And then recovery runs work really well for elites, but any run that I did, it was never truly recovery. Every run had a little bit more breakdown. So that's why I only ran 3, sometimes 4 days a week in my best marathons, because I found that anything to do with recovery was cross training. I had to get off the tendons, get off the bouncing. I could never quite tolerate or call something truly a recovery run. It was an easy run cardiovascularly, but the tendons weren't recovering even though I was running at a slow pace. So I was better off doing some other kind of activity than. So recovery runs, whether you're truly recovering or just creating more damage, it really depends. But the elites can get away with it. So quick summary, injuries are not your fault. They're my parents' fault. And some things just don't go away. So you might want to, if something doesn't go away, I've had people had an injury for a year and they took a year off and it's the same. That means they have scar tissue. There's something in the tissue that stuck it together to protect it and just didn't let it go. Running, you got to be more careful than other sports. And that's just all those things that we're summarizing. Any questions?
I just want to say that was really awesome, Aaron. Thank you so much. That has answered a lot of questions that I've had. And
Good.
You've broken this down brilliantly and did very well in a small Zoom screen with a very large leg and ankle. So thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Do you have a question on compression socks and running with them and pros, cons? Do it, don't do it.
Why are you using them?
I haven't been, but I have been, and again, in this talk, I'm slightly proud of myself and that I'm starting to feel a little bit of shin sprints. So I'm realizing, okay, I am pushing myself, which is good. But I clearly hear now I'm pushing myself too hard, too fast. And yeah, so it's shins hurting. In my limited Google skills, compression socks is one of the ones that comes up. So here is where that question comes from.
Oh, okay. Do you feel better using them?
I haven't used them at all yet.
Oh, you haven't used them.
Yeah.
So shin splints is another good example of, it's the tibialis posterior tendon. Typically, it can be compartment syndrome. It's a general term. So it's again another one of those tendons that was just sort of overused in that side-to-side plane I was talking about. So even stabilizing the hip and activating that, and why is it getting pulled? There's sort of a. So, but what can a compression sock do for that? Compression socks. So you basically have such a tight fascia. If you go under your skin, and your skin is, especially as you get older, it's quite mobile. So the skin is a very mobile structure. So if you're compressing all the way around it, you'll never come close to the ability of the fascia that's layers deep to that. I mean, fascia they have to sometimes almost amputate a foot that fascia gets so tight if it swells within that. A compression sock can never come close to the compression ability that you have within your leg. So it's not truly, if anything, because blood flow is, the veins come on top of it. If anything, you're reducing potential blood flow. You might be reducing a little bit of swelling to it. So there's not, it's something I can't really say there's enough research on that. If it feels better though, it's going to inhibit pain signals if you just sort of rub. If you're aware of something that's around your leg, you might run a little bit differently. It might inhibit the joint in such a way that the feedback loop is unpredictable, but it might to some degree even stabilize that tibialis posterior tendon. That doesn't necessarily happen with other people. I mean, the only time I wouldn't use it if you're really hot, because we know that temperature in a muscle, and if you wear it after, I think it's good for venous return. Mm-hmm. So that's where it's fully proven, is on airlines and just keeping that vascular system going maybe after a run. They found that it delays glycogen reuptake if you wear it too long, because it's compressing something that no longer needs to be compressed as well. So it's kind of a gray area, but I bought them too. I tried them. I had them for a while. I didn't really like the feel of them, and they're not truly going to be the solution. But if they help it feel a little bit better, and because you're aware of it, it guides your leg in a different way that we can't measure biomechanically, then wear them until you don't need them, until they get too hot. But they're just not. Now, what compression going up to the hips and pelvis, and if you have instability in the SI joints, and those are so tight that they will actually take joints and squeeze them together. And there's SI belts that I sometimes have, patients wear, that those become a little bit more, because they hold you in such a way they don't let your hips move. Whereas a compression sock is a little bit less than that. So there's probably less potential benefit, but if it feels good, there's no reason not to wear it.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. That was awesome. I missed your talk last year, so it was great that I could catch up.
Good. Yeah, that's a long answer to all the questions, but I tend to do that. Great. Maybe I answered the next 4
which was great.
While I rambled on.
Does anybody else have any questions? Otherwise, I will.
Yeah, I have one. Yeah.
Hello.
Okay. How are you?
Good. Thanks. How are you?
Good. This about the keep your ceiling high. I feel that's been my problem lately, because I've been running just running, no like for any goal.
Yeah.
And like few years before, I was running for a half marathon, so I always push myself a little bit. But the last 2 years, I've been just running, and I feel totally that thing that your ceiling keeps going lower. So it's that. Now I have the explanation for it. But my question is about some stretches, exercises specifically for my group. So in Dumba right now, I have like a little bit older crew. So I feel like some of the stretching exercises are a bit hard for them to do. So I was wondering, what is your recommendation for people that are not that flexible?
In order to increase their ceiling? Or?
No, like this is in general, like stretching exercises after the run.
And what are you doing now? Is there anything they're doing now?
So I'm doing the typical, like going like to the main muscles, but for holding the knee to the back from the ankle, I feel that's already a little bit hard for some of them.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, if you're each joint, if they have a little bit of arthritis or something underlying, then you obviously would never want to push that. Generally speaking, based on the ceiling and what I was talking about, one of the best ways to get more range of motion is not just to hammer away on trying to push it harder, because it's not necessarily scar tissue. It's not necessarily, for some reason, over time, the ceiling of everything, the ability of a joint to have mobility, everything closes in. It sounds claustrophobic, but the body will, if they don't train it. So I would suggest getting in whatever position they can get to. So if it's like putting their leg back, or doing a hamstring stretch with a straight back and sticking the butt out, so you're actually the ischial tuberosity, you're just strengthening the hamstring, and then pushing against it, using their muscles at that end range. So if I put my foot up on a bench, put it there, and then push down for 3-4 seconds quite hard, and then pull up, try to actually pull it off the bench. So there's this thing called controlled articular rotate, where you're taking joints, and through a range of motion at the end range, if you push it in a few different directions, or just forward back for this one, you'll tell the nervous system that that person is trying to protect that joint, and they feel that that joint is in danger. So the flexibility will be temporary, even if they stretch it for a minute passively lying on their back. The next day it's going to be the same, unless there's some kind of signal that they can actually use it at that end range. So ideally, sometimes to break through those gaps is to get them in a stretch that, and clearly if it's arthritic or something, you don't want to do this if there's bone on bone, of course. But if it's just a limitation or tightness in the muscle, have them push in, just, not that hard. You don't want to hurt themselves. push into the bench and then pull up and then see if they can go. And usually even right away, there's a little bit of a signal saying, okay, we just fired up some muscles. You're less likely to dislocate your joint. You've shown us that you're going in the right direction educationally, because the nervous system is 100% always getting feedback to whether or not that joint will dislocate at one point in your life, and it's staying ahead of it with neurological tone. You know how they know this? I usually mention this in my talks. If you take someone and do a straight leg raise on their back and they go up to 70 degrees, and you give them orthopedic surgeons find this, general anesthetic, and then you think, oh, it's rock hard, they can't move a muscle, it's pure flexibility, you got to stretch that every day for a long time, and they turn their brain off. So the signal that sends the general anesthetic, it'll melt like butter another 10, 15, 20 degrees. So that was not their flexibility. That was their subconscious, but you can shut that down. And then as they came to out of general anesthetic, pop right back to where it was. They're back. So if you educate that, if you had them go to a certain thing, a hamstring, and then maybe pull it up with a towel, but then actually try to lift the leg up, or then push down at 70 and then up, you'll probably find that much quicker than just traditional stretching. It'll start to say, oh, that guy's got a little bit of strength here. Let's let go around the knee and the hip, which the hamstring attaches to. Let's let go of that a little bit, and he'll get a little bit more range. So you're taking off. The neurological component is way bigger than we thought. It's very clear. You can do it within anesthetic, 10 minutes. You can sort of figure out what's the real flexibility, how much of that is got to do with more protection, and you can get rid of that without going under general anesthetic every day by just end range strength. And that's why the squats don't bounce off the bottom of a squat because you're getting tired. Lower it, find it, stay down there, kind of move back and forth, and you'll get more flexibility in the hip and knees if you sort of play in those deeper ranges, safe ranges on the joints, but tell them so the muscle has control over it, rather than just a lot of passive stretching, which is okay too, but it'll have its limitations. Sorry, long answer again.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Right, if there's no other questions, we'll let you get off and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Okay, great.
Thanks you so much. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Speak
Bye,
to you
guys.
again. Bye-bye.
Yeah, you too. Bye.